Welcome to Indie Beacon Radio, where creative souls can find help in marketing their creations. You can send questions for each show on Twitter using the hashtag IndieBeacon. Now sit back and enjoy learning about our guest for this show.
Good evening, y'all. This is Channelie Charbonneau, and I am your radio host for this evening. Tonight, we've got a very special guest. His name is Wendell Mayo. Wendell, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing pretty good.
Wonderful. No, I'm doing great. Thank you for joining us. I know your time's very valuable, and we've got a great show tonight. And let's get right into it. So, Wendell, you have written quite a few books. Your books are very highly reviewed. Very impressive. Congratulations on that. I know that's not easy. Can you talk a little bit about what started your career into becoming a writer? Because similar to some authors, they start in one leg of their life and they kind of revamp it or redefine it into another leg of their life, being the authorship. So can you tell us how you got there? Because it's really interesting where you started.
Well, that's a pretty good question. I have, like a lot of writers, I have kind of a checkered past. I started out as a chemical engineer working for British Petroleum in the refining department in Ohio. Much of that had to do with the urging of my father, who was a physicist for NASA during the space race days and that sort of thing. So I guess after that, I found engineering to be really a creative field, but it wasn't creative enough for me, I suppose. So I got a journalism degree at night. A lot of what I did was just as you say, kind of a pursuit to discover for me what writing is. Writing is for many people different things. It's a very broad category. So I got the degree in journalism at night, and when I lived in Houston and worked in Houston for BP Exploration for a time, I worked part-time with the Suburban News in North Houston, covering high school football and basketball games and that sort of thing. And I enjoyed that. I enjoyed it all, but it really wasn't something that I felt was a calling, that was calling me to do it. So I then quit my job and signed on to the MFA program in writing at Vermont College in Vermont. And that's when I kind of discovered that I had a knack for telling stories. So it wasn't, writing is a very complex and technical field itself. It takes a long time to become a good stylist. But the other part of writing is finding your subject, finding something that really means something to you. And while I was in that MFA program, I discovered my family. I rediscovered the stories that my family had told me, especially those stories of kind of loneliness and homesickness from when we moved from Corpus Christi, Texas to Cleveland, so my father could take his job with NASA. So that kind of gave me my theme for my first book, Centaur of the North, was this sort of recapturing of the good old Corpus Christi days. That my mom taught.
Go ahead. Well, what I was going to say is your book. So the first book you mentioned is the first book that you did produce, and what's interesting about you is that you do write short stories, correct?
That's all I write.
Yeah. So a lot of people think that becoming an author or writing a story, it's got to be X amount of pages or maybe a lengthy plot and characters that morph. But you do a really good job about apparently there's this fan attraction you have for these great short stories that are kind of intermingled at some times and other times not, correct?
Yeah, I really enjoy, let's say for a book that has 10 to 12 short stories in it, runs about 150 pages or more, I'll write like 30 short stories, and then I'll start asking myself which ones have kind of a thematic similarity, and I try to interweave them. So that's kind of my process. I think I have a love of the short story form, but I have a novelist instinct to put things together so that they create a sense of place and a sense of character and that sort of thing that I think, and I envy novelists that. It's just, I don't have the soul of a novelist, and I've learned that over my years, but I do have the soul of a short story writer. I think stories are important. Stories are probably, in a lot of ways, are closer to poems than they are to
Wow.
novels, because they're so short, they're lyrical, they're also metaphorical in a sense. And they're the ways that, in my experience, we teach ourselves and we teach our children, our families, by telling stories, saying, I remember the time when a kid comes to you, and your child comes to you and says something like, gosh, Dad, I had a bad day at school. I was bullied, right?
Yeah.
Well, then Dad responds by saying, well, let me tell you about the time I was bullied.
Wow.
And
Wow.
I
I
think
never, go ahead.
those sorts of things matter, and I think they hold families together. So my first book was thematically kind of about that, how stories hold families together, or have them recall being dislocated from something, as far north as Texas to Ohio.
Wow. Wow. I never thought of him that way, but that is so true. Just brilliant on your analogy of short stories. And it is true. You do find out through knowledge and familial history through short stories. They don't go on forever, they're partitioned. So very, very interesting. So your first book, you did do this book in 1996 called Centaur of the North. That was your first experience in your authorship. You want to talk a little bit about that book and what started this all?
Well, I talked about the autobiographical sources, my family, but in particular, it's really important to have a point of view. In other words, a sensibility or a character who you follow story by story. So the first story, the point of view is a young man or a kid who's fascinated by how different his mother appears to be, living in the far north of Cleveland, Ohio. Her odd ways, she makes, this is again in Cleveland, Ohio, primarily an Anglo suburban neighborhood, and his mother makes pinto beans 3 or 4 times a week, tortillas, handmade tortillas. She's making tamales from scratch and this sort of thing. So he begins to find out that she's from Corpus Christi and part of a Latino community. She herself is Latino. Her husband is Anglo, a nuclear physicist, and he goes on this sort of quest and asks stories, try to investigate and figure out her background. And so each story sort of advances is another view, another sort of a prismatic view of this woman that he calls his mother, but he realizes he doesn't know her as well as he should. So that's kind of the premise of that book, and it's fairly autobiographical.
Yeah, I was about to say. So your family itself has this great history. So obviously that was relational to your experience with your family. Can you talk a little bit about your family? And because I think they're even more interesting than the book, but
Yeah.
how that all started. So can you talk about that?
Well, yeah. I mean, my father was born in the 1930s and during the Dust Bowl, and they lived in his father abandoned the family. I'll try to make this short. I know we only have 30 minutes, but so he ended up in a 1-room cabin with his sister and mother during the poverty years, and it was literally sort of a rags to riches sort of story. He joined the Navy, went to the University of Texas, got his degree, Phi Beta Kappa in nuclear physics, applied for a job with NASA. They accepted him, moved our family from Corpus Christi to Cleveland, Ohio, where I'm never quite sure how to say this because it's so bizarre. It's almost like Star Trek or something. He designed small nuclear power plants for deep space travel, put on spacecraft to go beyond the moon. So our family was this kind of nuclear space family that was that sort of followed his vision, which was space exploration and beat the Soviets during the 1960s and landing on the moon and all that sort of thing. And my mom was always supportive, but she was quiet. She was someone who I don't think she was homesick, very, very homesick, because she had left her family. So that's kind of the background of my family. I have a sister and two brothers, pretty normal, average family. But my subject matter has to do with this notion of being transplanted, of being almost like living on another planet, if you can imagine. If you've never left Texas, come to the Midwest and live for a while. It is like living in another planet.
Or vice versa, because I have family from the Midwest, and they come down here thinking this is still United States. I mean,
the cool thing about the United States is a cool place because there's so many different places, but it takes time to adjust when you make that a move that has that kind of distance, and cultural distance as well.
Yeah. So what's great is that you take, it almost sounds like the feelings that your mom has, and probably a lot of people have, who either have been transplanted at a different place or a different job, or maybe a different relationship that they didn't see coming or see ending or what have you. So I think our experience of feeling abandoned, we've all been there. We've all been there multiple times, whether it's, within your personal or professional life, or your spiritual life or your emotional life. Talk a little bit about that abandonment and how you've turned this into a great book and books and the way you present yourself as an author.
Well, let me just show you the cover of that book. This book is one of my favorite covers. It has the image of the horse, which alludes to the centaur, and then here's my mom with the flowers and that sort of thing. It's a very representational image for the Centaur book. And it took me years to sort of figure out the answer to the question that you just asked. I think I have it. This notion of my next book after the Centaur book, which was very much about displacement and that sort of displaced persons and homesickness and things like that. My next book was set in Lithuania, which is a former Soviet Eastern Bloc country that occupied during the Soviet times, was liberated quite suddenly when the Berlin Wall came down and that sort of thing. My wife is Lithuanian American, so her family had immigrated to the United States at the turn of the 20th century, like 1905, during the Tsarist oppression in Lithuania, where the Tsar was doing things like pressing people in the military service and shooting them and things like that. Yeah. So they were displaced as well. So she says to me one summer, why don't you just go over there and teach English and see what's going on? And my interest was really sort of whetted then, because I had grown up seeing the American side of the Cold War so much, so indoctrinated, beating the Russians in the space race, the nuclear arms race, and build up and things like that, that I went. And I started keeping a journal and realized that a lot of the things that I wrote about in the Centaur book, now I realize this notion of displacement, of a longing for a past that is more satisfactory, that's more human and more understandable, is all about Eastern Europe as well.
Wow.
And so I wrote, my second book has stories both from American points of view and Lithuanians' points of view, who are encountering Americans for the first time, expressing these not only seeing the other side of the Cold War, but also talking about the loss of culture, the loss of their heritage, the loss of family, who were deported to Siberia, who were put in work camps by the Nazis during the Second World War, or who fled to America, or many fled to America, Australia, England, and things like that.
Wow.
So it seems like a departure from my first book, but it's interesting. I tend to be a writer. History and news and current events tend to turn my head easily.
Wow.
And
Well,
I try
Wendell,
to find the truth of those things.
let's continue on that, but I want to leave it there because I just feel like this is a great subject to continue. So we will be back. We've got the very talented author Wendell Mayo. He is his new release is the Survival House Stories.
I am Grace Allison Blair, an award-winning author, motivational speaker, and modern mystic. I have combined spiritual and psychological principles in my nonfiction self-help books under Grace Allison and fiction books under Grace Blair. Go to modernmysticmedia.com to find Do You Have a Dream? 5 Keys to Realize Your Dream, and my novel, Einstein's Compass, a YA time traveler adventure.
Love to read? Love to meet authors in person? Then check out bookfestival.network to find a book festival in your region of Texas. We are adding book festival events throughout the year, so sign up to get notices and even a coupon towards purchase of a Texas author's book. Sign up at bookfestival.network.
The War Has Ended, but the Memory Lingers On has been written by Helen Munday and Christian Gutling. A story of a Dutch secret agent under German occupation, highlighted drama, and then the British rescuing him and teaching him how to navigate the ferry Swordfish airplane. This book can be purchased on Amazon and Barnes & Nobles, written by Helen Munday and Christian Gutling.
Welcome back to Indie Beacon Radio. Don't forget to like us, follow us, or subscribe to one of our many channels. Now, here is your host for today's show.
Good evening, y'all. This is radio host Shanalee Charbonneau, an awarded children's author. But most importantly, we've got a very awesome guest by the name of Wendell Mayo, and he is discussing his new release, Survival House Stories. Welcome back, Wendell.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Sure. So we left off, you were discussing about your family and, kind of becoming a migrant or being an immigrant and leaving behind everything you know and that feeling of abandonment and really kind of learning a new life. And I know that this is a hot topic in the news now. I myself, my grandparents immigrated from Ireland, so though it wasn't a direct, I did experience, them being very different from everybody else and my life being a little different, with how we did things. So definitely continue that and that influence of you becoming an author and how you've really put that really neat spin or understanding in your books.
Well,
what does it do in Survival House? How does that appear in Survival House?
Yeah, that's kind of another shift. It seems a little strange, but I was in Lithuania. I lived in Lithuania. I lived in Eastern Europe for a year.
Mm-hmm.
I was in Lithuania during 9/11. I had just moved there, and I wasn't back to the United States for a year after 9/11 happened. When I came back, it seemed like a completely different country. It was. I mean, the people were different. Our sensibilities were different. There was more fear in the country, I think, and rightly so, and that sort of thing. And it was about that time, it took a few years after that, it was about that time I realized I needed to sort of return to my country and stop writing about Eastern Europe, because I felt like this notion of arms buildup, of countries acquiring nuclear arms who were hostile to the United States and had never had these arms before. When I see those things in the news, because I'm an older person, I automatically recall the Cold War years. I automatically recall the years where the threat seemed it didn't seem more real, but it seemed like people were talking about it more. It was more in conversation. It was more, there were jokes made about it. I mean, sort of gallows humor and this sort of thing. There's duck and cover drills, and we sort of think of those as being funny now. And so, you know, people running into bomb shelters and that sort of thing. And it wasn't funny at the time, but now it seems sort of, so in writing Survival House, I wanted to sort of revisit those Cold War years and write stories that are set in the Cold War years. How that, what I call the mind of doom, sort of affected individuals in their daily lives and that sort of thing. And then I sort of combine those stories with stories that are set now, where people are experiencing the same sorts of fears, but they're expressing it differently. It just seems to me that people these days, we don't talk about it as much. It's in the news. It's always out there. Somebody else is negotiating with North Korea. Somebody else is dealing with Iran and that sort of thing. And I'm glad they are, but it's not something that, it's not a priority. During the Cold War years, the nuclear arms race was the priority. I mean, it was a big deal. And I know it's a big deal these days too, but it seems like a big deal among a lot of other big deals. So I wanted to write a book that's sort of like a book of stories that said, hey, you know, let's pay attention to this stuff a little bit more. So the characters in this book are either older people looking back on the Cold War years, or people these days sort of experiencing that sort of the prospect of annihilation and devastation for the first time. Young people experiencing that, and how they react to it. So I can give you some examples of, well, first of all, let me just show you the cover, not just to sort of brag about it, but this is actually one of those houses that they built at the Nevada test site. They call them survival houses. And they built them just for the, it seems funny now, but they built them just for the sole reason of blowing them up, just to see what would survive, how easily or more difficult it would be to survive a nuclear blast in this house. So they detonate the bomb with this house, and many people have seen those images of the wave, the sound wave, the bomb wave coming in, just flattening houses instantly. So it always amazed me that they would build houses, blow them up, and then say, well, I guess we won't survive that. So that's kind of, so the Cold War years were years where I felt we learned about how ominous the bomb was and that sort of thing. And I think those stories now, for me, were worth revisiting and retelling and that sort of thing. A lot of the stories in this book are humorous, because I think humor is a good way of coping with fear and understanding it. So pervasive. This is the back cover of the book. So this is a shot of Miss Atomic Bomb 1957, where they had a beauty contest, and you see the cotton. It's an atomic cloud. This was a series. I mean, this was how pervasive the notion of the bomb was in those days.
Wow, that's excellent, Wendell.
It was really funny. She actually makes an appearance in one of the stories, in the first story called Doomtown. In Doomtown, the small Midwestern town has the idea, instead of having the Radish Festival or the Watermelon Festival, the Tamale Festival, they decided to have a Doomtown Festival. It's a festival celebrating the fact that we haven't blown ourselves up yet. We're celebrating the fact that we're still alive as a species. And she makes an appearance, but she's like 75 years old. So it's a sort of resurgence or re-recognition of those days and that sort of thing. But anyway.
So if I understand correctly, you've put your own personal recollection of history in these books.
Yeah. For the most part, I mean, not the most part, probably, I don't know, a good portion of it is autobiographical, but I research my stories as well. I mean, if I need to know about the Nevada test site, I get on a plane and I go to Nevada. And
Wow.
I get the government clearance. You have to have FBI clearance to go there. And they'll take 10 people a month through the Nevada test site where they had all the nuclear test explosions in the 50s and 60s. And I went there, and it was quite moving. I mean, they make you like a rubber band your pants around your ankles so that no dust gets it in your boots or your shoes, because that dust is still radioactive after all these years.
And when did this?
This was back, well, this is only like a couple of years ago.
Wow.
And it's not dangerous levels yet, but it is dangerous if you kick up the dust. If you kick up the soil, underlying radiation can be harmful. So they tell you where to step and where to walk and everything. And we saw one crater called the Sedan crater. It was 330 feet. This is just a crater, 330 feet deep and 1,200 feet across. It's awe-inspiring. It's like an empty lake. It just really brought it home for me. So I tried to write stories that bring that sort of thing home for my reader as well.
Wow. And that influenced the Survival House, correct?
Yes.
Wow.
The survival. The title story is called Survival House, and it's based on a real semi-real experience of a young man who's newly married and he wants to rent a house. So he rents a house from a man who was in the Army Corps of Engineers at the Nevada test site, and his job was to build those houses, that they build them and then blow them up.
Mm-hmm.
And what he did when he retired from the Army is he stole the plans and built his own house as one of those survival houses, and then lived in it for a time, and then rents it out to this young couple.
Wow.
And they live in this rented house that's supposed to be blown up. That's sort of the premise of the story. As it proceeds, the old man, who's in his 80s, decides that he's going to start making modifications. So he sets up a tower. He sets up a blinking tower. He wants to install an atomic bomb, an actual bomb, in this man's home. And this is 2017, you know.
Wow.
So the point of view of the story is sort of like taking the Cold War years and all this sort of craziness and building these survival houses just to blow them up, and bringing it into our time, saying, here it is.
Yeah.
What would it be like to live in a place that was designed to be totally devastated?
Well, that's awesome. Yeah, let's we need to take a break, but let's continue this. Would love to. Again, we were talking to Wendell Mayo, who has just written the book Survival House Stories.
What would you do if you found out everyone on the town council were thieves and murderers? That's what happened in Bandera, Texas in 1873. John Cruder was the marshal, yet he needed to operate outside the law in order to balance the scales of justice. He is the Midnight Marauder. You can find his books on Amazon.com and TopWesterns.com in paperback, digital, and audio. I'm Roy Clinton, and I hope you'll read The Midnight Marauder.
Indie Lector is a store for serious readers and indie authors. Find great talent at indielector.store and save money on books with their book club. A portion of the proceeds helps get books into schools and libraries in need. Find a great book to read by an indie author at indielector.store.
What started as a love letter to her son has become an international love letter for all parents to their children. Now you can read acclaimed author Shanalee Charbonneau's story to your children. When her son was very sick, she calmed him by singing her own song to him. She turned that song into the book My Mama Loves Me, I'm Her Little Boy. She wrote 3 more magical books for all parents and kids 6 and under. Available at Indie Lector, Amazon.
Good evening. This is radio show host Shanalee Charbonneau. We are here talking to the inspiring Wendell Mayo, who's got the knack of doing research for his books way, way past, I think, most authors do, Wendell. So welcome back. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Awesome. So kind of finish where we left off with the survival house. You were talking about these characters who were living in a survival house, if you will, one that's built for destruction. And man, continue this because it's super interesting.
Well, I pretty much covered a lot of the story, but the key thing is that I want it's almost like another planet again. I want this house to suddenly appear today and have a young couple living in it. The point of view of the story is by a man who increasingly has the fear that his landlord, an 80-year-old survivor of the Cold War days in the Nevada test site, is actually equipping the house to be blown up. His wife assures him that he's just kidding around. It's a hobby of his. When he builds the tower to hold the bomb, and he talks about actually affixing a bomb to the top of it, and he begins to freak out. At the same time that this is going on, the young couple who are just married are going through those discussions of having their first child, right?
Yeah.
So to add to that fear of this guy who's building this house, the point of view character, the protagonist, is worried about whether he wants to bring a child in to this world and in that house. So I think it has a lot to do with, for me, writing it had a lot to do with those sort of big apocalyptic decisions that people make. You know, where do I live? When do I start my family? How do I want my children to live in the world? Do I want them to live in a world of fear and that sort of thing? So those two things are kind of side by side in the story. It's an unusual story.
You know, Wendell,
but I like it.
Yeah, no, I want to stop you there because I'm already into this. I'm already thinking, how the heck do I get my hands on this book and figure out what happened to this family? I mean, this is really amazing. And you know,
Well, it has a big ending. Well, kind of a big ending. It's not a boom. No one gets hurt.
Not even a boom.
No animals. No one gets hurt in this making of this book. But it has.
Go ahead.
Well, it has what I think is a pretty cool ending.
That's awesome. I'm sure it does because I'm already hooked. So can you talk a little bit about where your book is available? Where
sure. I think the best way to get a hold of my books is just to go to Amazon and just type my name in, Wendell Mayo, M-A-Y-O, and it'll come up. There's an author's page on Amazon. You click on the name, and it'll bring up an author's page and that sort of thing. I have my own website, but
that's fine. And you won a huge award. I want to make sure we get this in before we're out of time. The TIL award. That's no small feat, dear.
Yeah, I was surprised. I mean, you can't self-nominate for this thing. They just grab you and pick you. And I'd known about the Texas Institute of Letters when I lived in Texas during the 80s, working as an engineer, and I always thought, gee, it'd be kind of cool to be part of that. But when they called, I realized that the Texas Institute of Letters has been around since 1936, and it's indoctrinated many writers, such as Larry McMurdy, Saunders Cisneros, Cormac McCarthy, and last year I thought it was pretty cool. They inducted Willie Nelson for his songwriting talents. So, you know, I wish I got inducted last year. I might have got to meet Willie.
There you go. Yeah, I have met him. He's awesome.
Yeah, he is. Well, his music is cool. Really great. So okay. I'm really proud to have my work ranked among those writers.
Wonderful. Well, congratulations here, Wendell. You are super interesting and really appreciate you writing these short stories. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Indie Beacon Radio, where creative souls can find help in marketing their creations. To learn more about Indie Beacon services, to be a guest on the show, or to advertise on our show, please visit our website at indiebeacon.com.